58. Yeah, there's something wrong with that number, sorry. It's more than that, actually. But we had to kind of, when the Harwich Society wanted to put the board up, they had to define what was the Royal Navy Yard. You can only really call it the Royal Naval Yard once you get to the restoration of the monarchy, Charles II, and it becomes the Royal Navy Yard. Ships were being built before that. It just wasn't the Royal Navy, really. That's the truth of it. This is the Harwich Society website. This is an engraving of the Navy Yard, about 1850, I think. So this is actually a book called A Season at Harwich, if anybody knows it. But it was written by W.H. Lindsay, who was Bagshaw's architect. So if you go into Dovercourt and look at what's left of Bagshaw's intended empire, or intended new spa town, which is mostly the terrace up Orwell Terrace. There's a few other bits scattered around, but he went bankrupt. But he had a rather fantastic London architect called W.H. Lindsay, who went around doing these fantastic engravings. So what we see here is obviously a bit later than we're sort of generally talking about, but you've got a couple of, so we're facing into the river here. There's a couple of slipways, which are pretty always two slipways really. Once the Navy Yard gets going, that's what it's based on. And at the top of the slipways, we can see these things called capstans, which is how they pull the ships up. So imagine pulling one of these up. You're not using a diesel engine. You actually got blokes on a capstan pulling up the slip, which is quite a feat. Something you probably all know about, that's the treadwheel crane. So that's facing out, and wasn't, most people thought the treadwheel crane was kind of, putting masts and things on, but it wasn't really. It was actually hanging over the side of the dock. And so generally speaking, ships were coming in for repairs and stuff was being unloaded, or they were going out and stuff was going on them. And that's where the treadwheel crane was used. Again, no donkeys, no engines. It was men. So if you go and look at the treadwheel crane at any point, it's men running around in the hamster wheels, not anything else. And then we've got all sorts of kind of buildings on the Navy Yard, which sort of came and went really. And over different periods, the Navy Yard was a very different place. So if we go back to, go back to before it started becoming 58 ships, really certainly by Elizabethan times, the shipyard was notable. So Elizabeth I came to Harwich twice, in both cases really to see the strategic town of Harwich, because it was important, because it was where it was commanding this great anchorage where you could assemble a fleet, and it was a safe anchorage, so it meant that if there was a storm out at sea, ships weren't getting battered. So the town became strategically important, and Elizabeth I recognised that ships were being built here. So the time of Elizabeth I, so mid 1500s to sort of very early 1600s, there was a navy of sorts, but it was mostly a stolen navy. So in times of war, the monarch would say, right, I need a load of ships, and basically merchantmen would be pressed into service. So in other words, the Armada, so 1588, the Armada's coming, it needs to be repelled, and what happened was all the towns that held ships and had merchantmen working for them had to give up their ships, they had to arm them, and they had to go out and fight. So we know that Harwich sent, I think, at least three ships to repel the Armada. There's a lot of speculation. Christopher Jones could have been on one of them. So our great maritime hero may have been on one of them. He would have been 18 at the time, and he would have definitely been sailing out of Harwich at that point. So basically, any man that was able was put on the ship and sent out. Ships were being built in Harwich at that time, and there was a very important man called Mr. Pett, who was a shipwright at Harwich at that point. So if we fast forward then on to 1660, restoration of the monarchy comes. Now, that point is the point at which we become the Royal Naval Yard. And the Royal Naval Yard is all about Samuel Pepys. And, strangely enough, a man called Pett. So at that point, the Pett dynasty had continued for pretty much 100 years, and it was still son of Pett was still building ships. And a Pett was the master shipwright at Deptford, and Pepys hated him so much that he decided to put his protege, Sir Anthony Deane, in at Harwich. So they got a lease for the Navy Yard. Deane started building ships, and the big thing with Sir Anthony Deane was that he was kind of a very clever scientist, mathematician, and he really thought about how you make ships. Until then, it was a bit of a dark art. So the Petts were kind of celebrity shipbuilders, I guess. So when Elizabeth I came to Harwich, she was talking to a man that was kind of, talking in very round terms about how you build ships. And there were quite a lot of ships are built that were faulty. So they'd go out to sea and they'd be found to be absolutely terrible under sail, and then have to come back in to be refitted. And very often what they did was, when they say refit, what they often did was they ended up changing the shape of the hull. So example here might be that you add a whole load more planks to build a bit more mass and a bit more breadth at the base of the ship to give the ship more stability. And what Deane really did when he came along was to say, right, this needs to be written down and this needs to be done properly. So he started to actually produce a way of making ships. It kind of meant that he was less of a celebrity because he was kind of giving his secrets away in some respects. So I'm just going to show you very quickly this book. So this is based on Deane's Doctrine of Naval Architecture, and this will be in the library. This will be put in the library at the museum today. So there's actually 2 copies of it here. But this really is Deane's kind of skill. He goes through and he explains how ships kind of work and how to build them. So that's that. And then also we've then got, so Brian Lavery actually, a chap called Brian Lavery, put that book together based on Deane's original notes. He also wrote books like this, which effectively show us all the ships that were built at Harwich and other places as well, so we can put it in context to see what was going on at Harwich and why Harwich was so important. If we then sort of fast forward to a bit later on, we find that Harwich, the problem with Harwich is that it's quite small. So we've got a shipyard, we've got a town which is sending people all over the world really, but it's kind of constrained by its size. So Harwich can never grow. We know eventually it grows to Parkson, it grows up the river in the sort of Victorian era. But at that point in time, so I guess we're talking around sort of late 1700s, early 1800s, Harwich is really too small to be a naval yard because it's just not big enough. Ships have got much, much bigger. So Edward III's time, when he's assembling his fleet for the 100 Years' War, there's something called a cog, which is quite a small merchant vessel, castle at each end. But by the time we get to 1801, the yard is building HMS Conqueror, which is 74 guns, and it's going to go off and fight at Trafalgar. And it's a much, much bigger ship. And we can only really imagine how massive Conqueror would have been on that slip, and how much effort it would have taken. But really Harwich by then is too small, and you've got 2 slips, and if you want to build ships on the sort of scale that the Navy needs them at that point, you've got much better options at the Thames or on the south coast. So Harwich starts to go into decline, and really sort of post, certainly from the mid-1800s, all it's really building is Thames barges and fishing boats. So let's just go back to Conqueror. Let's just talk a little bit about Conqueror because it is the most famous ship that Harwich probably gave birth to. It was commanded by a chap called Israel Pellow, who was the captain at the time. And at the Battle of Trafalgar, the Marines from HMS Conqueror took the surrender of the combined French and Spanish fleet. So, burnt into history, and quite a nice vessel. So built by a chap called Joseph Graham. He'd come to the Navy Yard, long after Sir Anthony Dean. Sir Anthony Dean really was only at Harwich for a few years. He wasn't here very long. We celebrate him because he really found his feet at Harwich and started to, as I said, really sort of the trade and the craft of being a master shipwright suddenly became something that people could study and become good at. So by the time we get to Joseph Graham's time, it has become, as Pepys and Dean foresaw it, a kind of industrialised process. And they're turning out these great ships like Conqueror. So Joseph Graham, he took over the yard. I've been doing some research recently actually on the Globe, the pub The Globe, and we found out that Joseph Graham comes to Harwich to take over the yard. He starts building ships. His house burns down. So his house was originally on what was next to be the marketplace in Harwich, which is that bit next to the New Bell. His house burns down, so he builds Naval House. So if you're walking along King's Quay Street, you see that huge great big property, which is now part of the quay. He built that, and over the road at the Globe, it was his brother-in-law who was running the pub. And the Globe was actually the shipwrights' pub, so you can imagine, knocking off time in the yard, everybody just runs over to the Globe and has a beer. And there's some really nice pieces of research going on. So they give a supper, so they launch a ship, and there'd be a big supper in the Globe for all the ship workers and shipwrights. And as you know, the origins of the Guy Carnival, if you know Harwich, the origins of the Guy Carnival are again about the Navy Yard. So it's about the shipwrights and the apprentices wanting to have a bit of a carnival, if you like. Apparently what they used to do was parade models that they'd made. So quite a lot of shipwrights used to make models in order to imagine what it was they were building on a much smaller scale. So you'll find examples of these models being paraded through the town, which are lit by torches, and really it's really the kind of basis of the Guy Carnival that we see today. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to go through a bit of live research with you. So I'm just going to show you how, it's a bit personal, so it's how I go about looking for something online and trying to find out a bit about whatever I'm trying to find out about. So it might be a ship, it might be a pub, it might be a person, but really the technique's the same. You're really looking at archive sources and finding out what's there really. And then it's a case of putting all the pins in and then trying to join the dots up. As I said, books are really good still. I know we all go on about digital archives, but so much has gone into these that they're a great reference. And also, if you can, reading through it does give you a really good background. So they'll be in the library here from today. So by all means, come and grab those. And I'm going to sit over here, so some of you don't crane your neck, but
just while you're